11 dead as skydiving plane crashes in France, Al Jazeera. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. This isn't just a tragedy, it's a moment that forces us to ask hard questions about safety protocols in an industry that moves fast and takes calculated risks. Here's what we know. A single-engine aircraft carrying skydivers went down. The aircraft type, the weather conditions, the exact sequence of events, these details matter because they determine whether this was a one-off mechanical failure or a symptom of a systemic gap in how skydiving operations are managed across Europe. Let's start with the immediate context. Skydiving is a regulated activity, but regulation varies significantly between countries. France has strict requirements, pilot certification, aircraft maintenance schedules, weather minimums, but the incident suggests something broke through those safeguards. When 11 people die in a single event, investigators don't just look at what the pilot did or didn't do. They look at the entire chain: aircraft inspections, fuel quality, communication protocols, decision-making under pressure, and whether the operation was within approved parameters. Here's the critical part. Commercial skydiving has one of the best safety records in aviation when you measure incidents per jump. But single large casualty events like this one get international attention because they're rare and catastrophic. The moment you have 11 fatalities, regulators across Europe start reviewing their own operations. Insurance companies reassess risk. Families demand answers. And the industry faces a credibility test. Now, the stakeholder impact spreads in multiple directions. Skydivers and their families, they're grieving and seeking accountability. Skydiving operators across France and the EU are now under scrutiny. Some will face temporary suspensions or enhanced inspections. Regulators like the European Union Aviation Safety Agency will likely issue airworthiness directives or tighten maintenance intervals on similar aircraft. And the manufacturer of the aircraft, if a defect is found, could face recalls or modifications that cost millions. But there's a second-order effect nobody talks about immediately after these crashes. Insurance premiums rise. Smaller operators go out of business because they can't absorb the cost increase. The sport itself becomes less accessible. In countries like India, where adventure tourism is growing and skydiving is becoming more popular in places like Rishikesh and the Himalayas, incidents like this ripple backward. Insurance carriers get more conservative. Operators invest in better training and redundant systems. Prices go up. The thrill-seeking demographic gets older or shifts to safer alternatives. Here's what changes over the next few days. We'll see the French authorities release a preliminary report. We'll learn the aircraft's maintenance history, the pilot's experience, whether there were any maintenance flags in the weeks before. We'll hear about the weather, wind speeds, visibility, thermal activity. We'll learn whether this was a structural failure, a pilot error, or a chain of small decisions that compounded into tragedy. The contrarian angle here is worth noting. After every major aviation incident, there's a wave of grief, then a wave of calls for tighter regulation. But regulation doesn't prevent tragedies, execution does. A pilot who ignores a weather minimum dies just as easily whether the regulation exists or not. So the real question isn't whether rules will change, they will. The real question is whether operators will invest in the systems that make rules meaningful: better weather forecasting, real-time aircraft health monitoring, simulator training for emergency procedures, and decision support systems that flag go-no-go decisions before they become fatal. For skydivers globally, this is a moment of reckoning. The sport has grown. The operators have professionalized. But each crash exposes a gap. And this time, 11 people paid with their lives. If you're watching this and you've ever considered skydiving, or if you work in adventure tourism or aviation, this story matters. Not because skydiving is uniquely dangerous, it isn't, but because it shows what happens when systems fail at scale. One plane, one jump, one moment where something went wrong. And everything changed. Follow the investigation over the next week. Watch what the European regulators do. See whether this becomes a catalyst for systemic change or just another tragedy that fades from the cycle. The families of those 11 people deserve answers. The industry deserves a reckoning. And the sport itself deserves to know whether it's truly safe or just statistically lucky. For full analysis and what this means for adventure tourism policy, read the full brief at atlassignal.in. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.